There is a place in Australia so remote that the nearest town is a 4-hour drive across open desert, and the road gets so hot in summer that the tar turns soft beneath your tires. The population is under 200 people. The school has 12 students across 6 year levels. The doctor flies in twice a month. Mobile signal does not exist. And yet, when researchers ask residents whether they plan to leave, the answer is almost always the same. No, not yet. Maybe never. Australia is the 6th largest country on Earth, but most of its land holds almost nobody. The interior, the coast edges, the Red Plateau stretching west past everything. These are places where isolation is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be lived. And living, it changes you in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has never been there. This documentary visits 12 of Australia's most isolated towns, not just to list them or rank them, but to understand what holds people in places that the average Australian has never heard of and would never willingly visit. The towns on this list share one thing: their people, given every chance to leave, keep choosing to stay. We begin in the Pilbara. Marble Bar sits in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, roughly 1,500 kilometres north of Perth. The road from Port Hedland takes around 2 hours on a sealed highway. But once you leave that corridor, you are in country that does not accommodate carelessness. Marble Bar holds the Australian record for the longest consecutive run of days above 37.8 degrees Celsius, 160 days. That record was set more than a century ago and still stands. In summer, afternoon temperatures regularly reach 45 degrees. Shade is not relief, it is just a slightly different kind of heat. The town has a population of around 200 people. It has a pub, a small store, a caravan park, and a heritage museum housed in the old government buildings from the Gold Rush era. There is a swimming pool that becomes the social centre of summer life. And there is the stone itself, the jasper stone that runs in a vein through the Kungun River, banded red and green and black, the thing that gave the town its name when an early surveyor mistook it for marble. The people who live in Marble Bar are mostly connected to the pastoral industry, the mining sector, or to families who have been there for generations. Ask them about the heat and they shrug. Ask them about leaving and many will tell you the same thing. The heat is just weather. What you get in return is space and quiet, and a community where everyone is genuinely accountable to each other. In a place that hard, you cannot afford to be a bad neighbour. That enforced mutual dependence becomes, over time, something people do not want to give up. The heat is the price. The community is what they paid for. Heading east across the continent, into the far corner of Queensland, where the borders of 3 states meet, you find Birdsville. Birdsville is famous in Australia in a way that outstrips its size entirely. The population is around 100 people in a good year. There is a hotel, a bakery, a medical centre, a police station, and a small airport. The nearest large town, Charleville, is about 1,500 kilometres away by road. The road itself crosses the Diamantina River floodplain and portions of the Tirari Desert. When the Diamantina floods, Birdsville is effectively an island. Supplies come in by air. Everything waits. The Birdsville Track, which runs 520 kilometres south into South Australia, was one of the most feared stock routes in Australian history. Drovers used it to move cattle across country that killed horses and men with equal indifference. The town exists as a service point on that route and on the edge of the Simpson Desert, the largest sand dune desert in the world. 40,000 sand dunes running roughly parallel, north to south, each one requiring a vehicle to crest and descend before the next one comes. Every September, Birdsville hosts a horse racing carnival that draws thousands of visitors from across Australia, temporarily outnumbering the permanent population by a ratio that seems almost surreal. Then the visitors leave, and the 100 people who remain go back to being Birdsville. The residents talk about the stars. Without any light pollution within hundreds of kilometres, the night sky over Birdsville is something that people who grew up in cities genuinely cannot prepare themselves for. The Milky Way is not a faint smear. It is a structure, dense and textured, spilling horizon to horizon. Locals describe it as the thing that stopped them leaving the first time they planned to go. Not the heat, not the community, not the job, the sky. Moving into South Australia, into the Flinders Ranges, and then beyond them into the flat red country to the west, the town of Marree sits at the junction of two of Australia's most legendary outback routes. The Birdsville track comes in from the north. The Udnadatta track heads northwest toward the old Ghan railway line country. Marree itself has a population of around 80 people, most of them connected to the pastoral leases that cover millions of hectares of surrounding land. Marree was once a more substantial place. In the era of the old Ghan railway, which connected Adelaide to Alice Springs before the current alignment, Marree was a service town with a railway station, hotels, and enough movement to sustain a larger population. When the old Ghan was decommissioned in 1980, much of that reason to exist evaporated. The population contracted. What remained was the people who had no reason to leave, built into them by decades of being there. The Arabana people are the traditional custodians of the country around Marree, and the connection between the land and the people who know it most deeply is one of the oldest continuous relationships on Earth. When researchers from universities have come to document the area, they often note that the Aboriginal community's relationship to remoteness is not what outsiders assume. The land is not empty in any sense that matters. It is full of knowledge and meaning that only becomes visible if you stay long enough to learn how to see it. Northwest of Marree, past the salt flats of Lake Eyre, which Australians now more commonly call by its Arabana name, Kati Thanda, the town of William Creek sits on the Anna Creek Station, the largest cattle station in the world. The station covers 24,000 square kilometres, an area larger than Israel or Wales. William Creek's permanent population is somewhere between 6 and 10 people, depending on the season and who is counting. It has a pub, a small airstrip, and a position on the Udnadatta track that makes it a fuel and water stop for travellers crossing the interior. The pub at William Creek has become something of a legend in the Outback travel community. The walls and ceiling are covered in cards, badges, license plates, hats, and notes left by travellers from every country in the world, thousands of pieces of evidence that people passed through and wanted to leave something behind. But the people who run the pub and the people who work the station are not passing through. They are, in the most literal sense, staying. In a place where the nearest town of any size is hours away and the landscape in every direction is flat, red country, running to a horizon that seems impossibly far, staying is an active daily choice. Deeper into the Northern Territory, the community of Kaltukatjara, also known as Docker River, sits in the Petermann Ranges near the Western Australian border. Docker River sits in the Petermann Ranges in the southwest corner of the Northern Territory, near the Western Australian border, roughly 1,500 kilometres southwest of Alice Springs. The community is predominantly Anangu, the Aboriginal people whose country covers this portion of the Western Desert. The population is around 350 people. Access is via a dirt road from Eucla, the tourist hub near Uluru, and that road is not always open. In the wet season, sections become impassable. The community has a school, a health clinic, a store, and the kind of social infrastructure that remote Aboriginal communities have developed over decades of living far from the services that urban Australians take for granted. What makes Docker River significant in this documentary is not its infrastructure or its geography alone. It is the relationship between the Anangu people and the Western Desert that makes the question of leaving almost meaningless. The country is not a location, it is a relationship. The songlines that cross this part of the desert carry knowledge about water sources, weather patterns, food availability, and spiritual obligation. Leaving is not simply moving to another place. It is severing a relationship that has been maintained across thousands of generations. The question is not why nobody leaves. The question is why anyone would imagine leaving to be the obvious thing to do. Moving south, the community of Titjikala sits about 120 kilometres southeast of Alice Springs. To the Aranda people, whose country this is, the landscape is not empty ground. It is a library, every feature carrying a name and a story, going back at least 50,000 years. The town of Coober Pedy in South Australia has been called the opal capital of the world, and that is accurate. It has also been called the strangest town in Australia, and that is also accurate. Coober Pedy sits in the Stuart Range, 850 kilometres north of Adelaide, and the landscape around it looks more like the surface of another planet than anywhere else in Australia. Thousands of white mounds of excavated rock dot the earth for kilometres in every direction. The spoil heaps from opal mining operations going back to 1915. The population of Coober Pedy is around 1,700 people. drawn from more than 40 different nationalities, which makes it one of the most ethnically diverse small towns in Australia. The reason for that diversity is the opal. When opal was discovered here in 1915 by a teenager named Willie Hutchinson, prospectors came from everywhere. They kept coming. Greeks, Croatians, Italians, Lebanese, Chinese, Afghans, and their descendants, Aboriginal people from multiple groups whose country overlaps with the mining fields. All of them stayed because the opal kept producing. But Coober Pedy is also famous for something else: underground homes. The town has over 1,500 dugouts, homes carved directly into the sandstone hills, where the temperature stays a constant 23 to 25 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of what is happening on the surface. When surface temperatures reach 48 degrees, the underground residents feel nothing. They are already comfortable. The dugouts have carved-out bedrooms, lounge rooms, churches, and shops. There is an underground hotel where visitors can sleep inside the rock. Living underground in Coober Pedy is not a curiosity. It is the practical and obvious solution to a landscape that would otherwise make permanent habitation extremely difficult. Why do people stay in Coober Pedy? Because at any moment, a single noodling session through old spoil heaps might produce a stone worth $50,000. The opal is still there. People have been saying it is running out for decades. It has not run out. And as long as that possibility exists, the people with picks and headlamps and underground kitchens will stay. Heading into Western Australia's goldfields, the town of Laverton sits at the end of the sealed road network in that part of the state. East of Laverton, the Great Central Road runs to Uluru, a journey of around 1,150 kilometers across the Gibson Desert and the Gunbarrel Highway country, and it is not sealed for much of that distance. Laverton itself has a population of around 700 people, sustained by a mix of gold mining operations and services to the surrounding Aboriginal communities and pastoral stations. The history of Laverton is partly a history of gold rushes and their aftermaths, boom towns that shrank but did not die. The current gold mining operations give the town economic stability that many outback settlements have lost. But the people who are there for something beyond the mine are the ones whose stories are most interesting. Artists, writers, the descendants of Afghan cameleers, families whose gravestones represent 4 generations of people who chose, consciously or otherwise, to make Laverton home. Eucla sits on the edge of the Nhulunbuy Plain in Western Australia, very close to the South Australian border, and it holds a distinction that delights geographers. It is in the UTC plus 845 time zone, a time zone that exists nowhere else on Earth, except in this tiny corner of Western Australia. Eucla's population is around 60 people, mostly connected to the roadhouse and caravan park that serve traffic crossing the Nhulunbuy. But the reason Eucla is on this list is not its time zone or its roadhouse. Near the current town, about a kilometre south, the ruins of the old Eucla telegraph station sit in the process of being consumed by sand dunes. The station was built in 1877 to relay messages across the continent and was once a significant communications hub. The dunes have been advancing for decades, and what remains of the old station is now partially buried, the windows and doorways filled with sand, the walls still standing in sections, a structure being slowly absorbed by the landscape around it. The people who work and live in Eucla now look at those ruins every day. It is not a discouraging sight for them. It is evidence that the landscape has been here longer than the people and will be here after them, and that being part of it, even temporarily, is worth something. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, the town of Halls Creek sits at the intersection of country that was among the last in Australia to be explored by European settlers and is among the most geologically ancient on the planet. The Kimberley is the site of some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth, formations that were ancient before complex life existed. Halls Creek itself has a population of around 1,400 people, mostly Aboriginal, with the community connected to Gija, Jaru, and Kija traditional lands. Halls Creek has faced significant challenges in recent decades, the kind of challenges that small remote towns with high proportions of Aboriginal residents often face within a social service framework designed primarily for urban populations. But what is also true about Halls Creek is something that urban Australians rarely read about. The community has produced artists of international reputation, musicians, cultural practitioners, and language keepers who are doing the slow and essential work of maintaining knowledge systems that survive nowhere else on Earth. The art produced in and around Halls Creek and the broader Kimberley has found its way into galleries in Sydney, London, and New York. The knowledge being preserved there exists nowhere else. When people ask why residents of Halls Creek do not simply move to a larger town with better services, the question itself contains an assumption worth examining. Moving would mean leaving the country that holds that knowledge. The knowledge and the country are not separable. Far to the north, on the Coburg Peninsula in Arnhem Land, the community of Minjilang sits on Croker Island, accessible only by small aircraft or boat. The permanent population is around 300 people, mostly Iwaija people, whose connection to this coast and its waters goes back thousands of years. There are no roads in or out. The sea is both the boundary and the highway. The waters around Croker Island are extraordinarily rich. Barramundi, mud crabs, dugong, turtles, and the full complexity of a marine ecosystem that has been managed sustainably by the Iwaija people for generations. Commercial fishing operators occasionally push against the boundaries of the sea country, and the community pushes back. What they are protecting is not just food. It is a relationship with a living system that they understand at a depth that no visiting researcher can replicate in a short field season. Why do people stay in Minjilang? Because the sea is there, because the knowledge is there, because the obligations are there, because home is not a feeling you can pack and take somewhere more convenient. Back on the Australian mainland, in the far northwest corner of the Northern Territory, where Arnhem Land meets the Arafura Sea, the township of Nhulunbuy sits on the Gove Peninsula. Nhulunbuy was established in the early 1970s to service the bauxite mining operations that operate nearby, and for decades it functioned as a mining town with all the infrastructure that implies. Population peaked at around 4,000 people. Then the mine and the refinery reduced operations significantly in 2013, and the town contracted fast. What happened next in Nhulunbuy is something that researchers of remote communities find instructive. The people who left were mostly the mine workers and their families, the population that had come for economic reasons and left when the economic reason changed. The people who stayed were the ones whose reasons were not economic in the simple sense. Teachers, doctors, people married into the Yolngu community, people who had been there long enough that Nhulunbuy had become the only version of home that made sense. The town is smaller now, around 3,000 people, but it is not the ghost town that some predicted. It adapted. Towns that adapt are towns that understand something about why people stay in the first place. The Yolngu people, whose country the Gove Peninsula sits within, have their own long answer to why nobody leaves. The answer begins with the concept of gurutu, a kinship system so comprehensive that it defines your relationship not just to other people, but to everything in the natural world. Every animal, plant, weather pattern, and landform has a gurutu relationship to the people of this country. Leaving would not just mean losing a place. It would mean losing your position in a relational system that structures all of existence. The last town on this list is perhaps the most extreme in purely geographical terms. Bedourie is the administrative centre of the Diamantina Shire in Outback, Queensland, about 200 kilometres west of Birdsville, on a road that crosses the Diamantina floodplain country. The population is around 100 people. The Shire itself covers 94,000 square kilometres and contains a total population of around 300. Bedourie has a hot spring, an artesian bore that brings water from the Great Artesian Basin to the surface at a temperature of around 40 degrees. The spring feeds a small public pool, and it is this pool, in the middle of one of the most isolated and arid pieces of country in Australia, that locals describe as the emotional centre of life there. On an evening when the day's heat is finally easing, families gather at the hot spring pool. Children swim, adults talk, the stars come out, the silence beyond the sounds of the water, and the conversation is absolute. A researcher who visited Bedourie to study the effects of isolation on mental health expected to find evidence of the psychological cost of remoteness. She found some. She also found something she had not expected. The residents of Bedourie demonstrated measurably higher scores on certain measures of social connection, purpose, and meaning than age-matched comparison populations from regional and urban centres. The isolation that looks, from outside, like deprivation, had produced something that people in denser places were struggling to find. This is not a universal story. Isolation without adequate services causes real harm. Remote Aboriginal communities in Australia have faced, and continue to face, the consequences of geographic remoteness combined with systemic underfunding, and the outcomes in health, education, and life expectancy are a national failure that no romanticisation of the Outback should be allowed to obscure. But that is a different story from the one this documentary is telling. The towns on this list are places where people, having understood the full weight of their location, chose to remain. The heat, the distance, the limited medical access, the single school teacher covering multiple year levels, the satellite phone as the lifeline, all of it weighed, and the scale still tipped towards staying. What those 12 towns have in common is not geography, though they are all remote. It is not history, though each has a history shaped by that remoteness. What they have in common is that the people who live in them have found, in the conditions that urban Australians consider prohibitive, something that feels irreplaceable. Community woven tight enough to hold. Night sky, undimmed by 1,000 competing lights. Land that has been known and named and sung for longer than recorded history. The particular pride of choosing a hard thing and doing it well. Australia is mostly empty in terms of human habitation. These 12 towns are some of the things that fill that emptiness. What the people who stay are telling you is something about what human beings need, which turns out to be less urban than assumed. They need to matter to the people around them. They need a sky and a silence that are worth having. The desert keeps its own time. The people who stay are still learning.